It's not a policy talk. We're going to talk about nocturnal pollinators, all those critters that are on the night shift, visiting flowers and helping move pollen around. So thanks for inviting me here, Dawn, and for all of you for coming tonight. As Dawn mentioned, my name's Kaitlin Hasse. I'm based in Santa Fe as a pollinator conservation specialist for the whole Southwest region. Most of my work is kind of place-based more in northern New Mexico, but I'm happy to keep working on projects in other parts of the Southwest. But yeah, I'm excited to talk a little bit more about nocturnal pollinators. But before I get into that, I want to see how many people have heard of the Xerces Society. A lot of you. Good, good. Is anyone members here? Yay, thank you. That's amazing. So we're an international nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. That's where our headquarters are. But we have staff all throughout the US, one person in Canada, and we work to conserve the wildlife that are invertebrates. So animals that don't have a backbone. So things like all the insects and arthropods like spiders, and butterflies, bees, dragonflies, but also things like freshwater mussels. We have a pretty big freshwater mussel program up in the Pacific Northwest. So we're doing all kinds of work to conserve the habitat, assess species, and help people understand more about pollinators and reduce pesticide use all across the country in many different avenues. So what's really cool about our group is that we are the largest organization dedicated to invertebrate conservation in the world. We have just about 100 staff now. So that's a really huge milestone really for invertebrate conservation. They've definitely been a little overshadowed by bigger wildlife like birds and bears and whales, but insects are just as critical for our environment. And really, they make up the vast majority of biodiversity on Earth, composing of 94% of species that do so many different ecosystem services like pollination, seed dispersal, decomposition, food webs, all those things are really dependent on insects and other invertebrates. We've been around since 1971, and we're named after this blue butterfly. Usually people are like, why Xerces? Isn't that some Roman thing? But we're actually named after this blue butterfly here. This is the Xerces blue butterfly. It was a species found in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it lived in the sand dunes along the coast there. So with the development of the San Francisco Bay Area, that habitat was destroyed. And this is the first insect species we know of to have gone extinct in North America due to human disturbance. So in naming ourselves after the Xerces blue, we're dedicating our work to preventing the extinction and loss of other invertebrates. So that's a little bit about Xerces. We do our work in a few different program areas. So we have a program that focuses on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity. This is our biggest program where we work mostly with NRCS and farmers to help farmers grow pollinator habitat in farms and ranches, and also work with them to create beneficial insect habitat. So they have lots of predators to help control pests on farms and reduce pesticide use. We have an endangered species program, which works to understand which of our insects and invertebrate species are really in decline and need the most help. They have a big program on bumblebees, on monarchs, and then also on fireflies. We're trying to understand a little bit more about those insect groups and what we need to do to best conserve them and keep those different species from going extinct. That also includes our aquatic invertebrates program, where we work with these freshwater mussels in the Pacific Northwest. We have a pesticides program that works across all the different programs to help reduce pesticide use. and get better understandings of how different pesticides affect insects, because that's usually a very understudied, unknown field. The EPA does not regulate management and knowledge of pesticide impacts on any native insects. So it's an important work we're doing there. Then we have urban conservation. Have you guys heard of Bee City, Bee Campus USA? Dawn has? So that is a program where cities commit to creating habitat, doing education, creating an IPM program for their cities or campus, and then become an affiliate of Bee City USA or Bee Campus USA. So maybe Silver City or Western New Mexico University might be interested. So that's another way we get folks involved with pollinator conservation. Okay, enough about Xerces. Let's talk about pollinators. So pollinators get a lot of attention, and it's really well deserved, right? They're insects mostly that move pollen from one plant to another to help them reproduce, spread genetics, and create seeds for the next generation of plants. And the vast majority of our flowering plants depend on animals for pollination. So about 85% of all flowering plants need animals to move their pollen. There's things like oaks and some grasses that are more wind pollinated. That's what gives you allergies this time of year sometimes. So those produce a lot of pollen that's not really nutritious, but they produce it in such mass that the wind blows it and helps create pollination to happen. But most flowers, the ones that are really pretty and attractive, they have pollen that's heavier, it's more nutrient dense, and it attracts animals. And they might make nectar to attract those animals to visit their flowers and move that pollen from flower to flower. So when we think about pollinators, we're usually thinking about the daytime active pollinators, the ones you actually see during the day. So if you Google pollinators, this is what comes up. You have bees and butterflies all on a bright sunny day. And that includes things like our butterflies, our bees, things like hummingbirds, but also some things that you might not think of as pollinators. So flies are really important pollinators, wasps, and beetles. Those are all insects. And one vertebrate, the hummingbird, that visit flowers to drink nectar. So they're visiting those flowers to drink nectar. The bees are visiting mostly to collect pollen because that's what their babies eat. So female bees go to collect pollen from flowers, but all these insects are visiting to drink nectar during the day. But at night, we have a whole different suite of animals visiting flowers at night. So we have things like moths, which also, I'll talk about this later, but they also visit during the day. You'll see moths out during the day as well. Beetles, bees, some bees actually stay up pretty late and might be pollinating during a full moon if there's enough light. So some species have adapted to move around more at night, some beetles as well. And then there are some other critters that are also visiting at night, some flies, crickets, ants, thrips, geckos, sometimes different mammals, but the vast majority of pollination at night is done by our moth species. And the two families that really come up are the Noctuidae and the Sphingidae. So the noctuids and then the hawk moths. You guys are probably a little familiar with the hummingbird moths. So nocturnal pollinators, we don't know a lot about them because they're definitely not as easy to study as our day active pollinators, but we're learning more and more from recent research that nocturnal pollination is a huge part of pollination. So there's studies from Arkansas that found at night, the insect visitors, mostly moths, contribute just as much seed set in apple orchards as day active pollinators, which is pretty crazy considering we've spent so much time thinking about bees and bee conservation that half of pollination in certain situations can be done by these moths. And then there's also some other evidence showing contribution to things like blueberries, other fruit crops, and lots of other wide range of different crops. But yeah, like as some of you probably know, insects are just kind of more relatively understudied and harder to study compared to other wildlife species. But then you add the other element of night and not being able to observe as well as daytime pollinators. There's still just a lot of work we don't know. But it's really starting to give us this picture that pollination is done 24/7. So moths are generalists, most of them. So they're visiting a wide variety of different plant families, different species. This is called a pollinator network. So up here we have different pollinators and then the different plants they might visit. And if you can see that there's some that only visit a few, maybe all of them, like this bee visits all the plants. You can also have moths that visit all of those plants as well. So it's a really incomplete picture if you don't understand what is happening at night in a pollination network. And what's really a big concern when we're thinking about pollinators, we've documented declines across the globe of lots of different insects, and we're usually thinking about habitat loss, pesticide use, climate change. But for nocturnal pollinators, one of their biggest main threats is light pollution. So this artificial light at night, or ALAN, can really reduce the ability of pollinators to visit different flowers because they're buzzing around lights all night instead of going to the flowers they need to see. And lucky for us, we're in an area where we do have amazing night skies, and this is a great opportunity for us to study these interactions in a more natural setting compared to the rest of the eastern US that doesn't get to really see the Milky Way or have really dark skies that are impacting these natural occurrences of insects visiting flowers at night. And I'll just mention that there's lots of flowers that do stay open all night long, but there are some that may close at different times of day. So that's called floral nyctinasty, for a fun little term for you to learn. Some flowers close, like your primrose, your Enophera. Those are typically exhibiting that. Things like mirabilis, those exhibit floral nyctinasty. So what we kind of do know is that about a third of plant families do have species that depend on nocturnal pollination. And most of those species occur in xeric places, so like the desert. And so when we're thinking about why plants might prefer or evolve to be pollinated at night might be due to water stress. If their flowers are open during the day in the heat of the day and the sunlight, they can lose a lot of water that way. So this is one reason why some plants might have evolved to open more at night, be pollinated more by nocturnal insects, because they could lose less water by doing that. And if you want to attract pollinators at night, that's a little harder to do compared to during the day. You've got to figure out how to signal to a pollinator that you're there. So most night pollinated plants are typically a white or pale in color, which helps reflect that moonlight, or it's just more visible in dark landscapes. And then often they have a really strong fragrance. and that helps the pollinator hone into that nectar source. So things like your Datura. And another thing that might attract some pollinators to flowers is that some flowers can produce heat or use thermogenesis, which they're capturing during that solar radiation during the day. And those insects are able to detect that and find those flowers easily, and maybe hang out in them longer and have a better chance of moving that pollen around. Now, I mentioned there were those nocturnal pollinators versus the diurnal, the daytime active pollinators, but it's really a bit more complex than that. So we have a lot of species, a lot of our mammal wildlife species, big species you'll see, are active more around dawn and dusk. So those are technically crepuscular species. So they're active not quite in the very middle of the night and not in the middle of the day. And there are lots of moths that exhibit this. So things like the white-lined sphinx moth that I'm sure you guys see lots of during the growing season. You'll see them in the middle of the day. You'll see them in the middle of the night. They're very adaptable to flying around at different times of day. And many bees are diurnal. They're only active during the day, but there are a few, about 200 crepuscular species that stay active later into the evening or really early in the morning. And a small few set of bees that actually fly at night, which is pretty crazy because bees aren't typically adapted for that. So what do you guys notice the difference between these two bees? Can you point out anything that's like, oh, that looks very different? Which eyes? The ones on top, very good. So on the left here, we have a daytime active bee, and these are called ocelli, the 3 eyes on top of their head. They have 2 big compound eyes, which helps them see color and light, and then the 3 at the top of the head, those are more for a little bit of light and just understanding kind of where they are in the world. This one, they're quite reduced, but in the one on the right here, those eyes are huge, right? Those are really big ocelli on top, so they can get in a lot more light in those ocelli to help them navigate around in darker light. So that's one way you can tell a bee that is able to move around more at night. And then there's just a couple cool examples here of bees that fly in the dark, but when the moon is out. So there's the large carpenter bee on the top here. It's been documented to fly even on moonless nights. So it's pretty cool that there's a couple bees out there that are able to fly in the absolute dark. And I do want to mention beetle pollination real quick, because I'm going to deep dive into moths, but I want to mention that beetles are really understudied. We really don't know much about their nocturnal pollination habits, but many are active during the day and visit flowers. But there are also a lot of flowers that have really strong scents that are beetle pollinated and are probably visited at night as well. So they're probably attracting flies and other beetles, both during the day and at night. And finally, since I am so close to the border and where there are actually pollinating bats, I did want to mention the 2 nectivorous bat species that occur in New Mexico. We have the lesser long-nosed bat, which is exciting to be the first bat that's been delisted from the Endangered Species Act. So there's been a lot of great conservation work to help boost their populations. Then there's also the Mexican long-tongued bat. Both are visiting columnar cacti, so saguaros, and organ pipes, but also lots of agave species. And they fly really, really far. I think probably further in one night compared to any other pollinator. So they're moving pollen really long distances. So they're really helping with that genetic exchange of pollen between lots of different plant populations. So they're really critical to our agave and cactus species. And I don't know, I'm curious to hear, does anyone hear that other bats are pollinators or that yucca is pollinated by bats? No, I hear that all the time. I'm like, actually, yucca is pollinated by a moth.
Pollinated by specific moths.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about them, but yeah, I just find it funny that there's a lot of people that think yucca is visited by bats, and visited and that bats up in northern New Mexico are pollinating, but it's really just these two nectivorous bat species that you'll find in New Mexico. All the other bat species are insectivorous, so they're eating the moths that are pollinators more so. So that's why if you're thinking about bat conservation and attracting moths, that's one of the best things you can do for bats is attract lots of moths that they can eat. So just something that I hear that I want to ask, like, is that something you guys hear? So, all right, let's talk about moths. So I just want to cover like what is a moth? How are they different from butterflies? What does their life history look like? And what roles do they play in our ecosystems? So moths are crazy diverse. They're not beetle levels of diverse, but they're pretty impressively diverse. So we have 160,000 species worldwide is the current estimate, about 12,000 species in the US. And if you compare that to butterflies, there's only about 800 species of butterflies in the US. So if for every one species of butterfly, you have like almost 12 more moth species. So, and they come in so many different shapes and sizes and different life habits. So we have things like the five-spotted hawk moth here, which is also known as the tomato hornworm, but they also visit flowers and pollinate and nectar on lots of different flowers. So that's one major core group of moths that are major pollinators. Then we have a lot of moths that, like the beautiful Saturnids that are the big silk moths. These moths, lots of different families of moths, their adult phase is super, super short-lived, and they don't even eat in that phase. So they don't visit flowers. Those moths aren't visiting plants or flowers and nectaring and moving pollen. Their lives are just so short. They're just there to breed, make more caterpillars. The caterpillar stage is the eating stage. And these big, beautiful moths you only see for a very brief amount of time. Then there's another giant category of moth, the micro moths, that are just incredibly diverse. And I'm definitely not a moth great identifier. So there's lots of those that are probably the potential to find lots of new species is out there just about in every state, I'm sure, for us to keep finding. So a moth versus a butterfly. Is there anything that you guys use as the main decider when you look at a moth versus a butterfly? What do you think is the big difference there?
The antenna.
The antenna, yes. So if you see on this guy, those are big and clubbed at the end. Well, you can't even see the antenna on this one. But usually you think a butterfly is big and bright and flashy, and a moth is drab and brown and creeps around at night. But that's not always true. There's butterflies that are a little brown and drab, and moths that are a little more bright and active during the day as well. But as you mentioned, the antennae are the big giveaway. So the butterfly antennae have this big clubbed nodule at the end. Moths have just sharp little points at the end, or they are feathered. Oops, I went the wrong way. There we go. Or they have these like big feathery antennae. And usually those are the male moths have the larger, more feathery antenna to help them track down females. So there's pheromone receptors on those antennae to help them find females. So caterpillars are a little more tricky than adults. So I'm sure you guys recognize these tent caterpillars. Those are moths that are, a lot of times moth caterpillars can be more hairy, but not always. And one thing to consider about hairy moth caterpillars is sometimes they can be a little bit stingy. So I don't know if you guys got that spruce tussock moth in the Gila as much as northern New Mexico. But just this summer, if you walked around in northern New Mexico, the tussock moths were falling on you and stinging you all summer long. And then typically like this monarch caterpillar here, they're typically don't have as much hair. But that's not always the case. There's always exceptions in biology, right? So there's the hornworms, those are Sphingidae, hawk moth caterpillars. They have the little horn at the end. That can kind of be a giveaway to help you know, is that caterpillar a butterfly or a moth? And just to again highlight moth diversity, there's so many different shapes and sizes of moths. And this is a really cool little like help you narrow down image guide on bugguide.net. Does anyone use Bug Guide? I love Bug Guide. And to give you a range of how big a moth could be, this is the largest in the world, is a Hercules moth with a wingspan of 11 inches. And then the smallest are in the genus Stigmella with wingspans around 3 millimeters. So they can be massive and they can be absolutely tiny. Another typical characteristic of moths is that some are colorful. I showed a couple tiger moths those are usually very colorful, but then there's also really cryptic moths. So there's these bird dropping moths that look like little bird poos. I kind of like that example of cryptic, not exactly camouflaging themselves into what they're on, but identified as something not tasty. And then we have moths that are really cryptic and blend well into trees. And one cool evolution story about moths is that the peppered moth here, during the Industrial Revolution, their color became darker because of the amount of soot on everything compared to the less industrial areas of England where they were lighter in color and weren't blending in with the soot covered everything. So that's another neat detail of evolution and camouflage. And then like our bees and lots of other insects, moths experience a life cycle of complete metamorphosis where they start out as an egg and then hatch into a larva and experience several instars where they grow from those tiny little hatchlings to a much bigger instar that then pupates and becomes an adult. So this pupa here, the difference between butterfly and moth is that a moth makes a cocoon and a butterfly makes a chrysalis. Thank you. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about moth behavior now. So moths are really attracted to light. That's like a whole, a moth to a flame. There's sayings and all kinds of uh, euphemisms about it. Moths navigate by something called transverse orientation. They have evolved to migrate and find food. Determining their location by moonlight is the going theory, and staying on course by keeping a fixed angle with that moonlight. So the moon is really not moving and as fast as where they're going. So as long as they stay in a direction where that moon stays at the same orientation where they are, they're typically going in a mostly straight line or wherever they're trying to go. But the appearance of all these artificial lights has not given moths enough time to adapt and learn that they can't orient by these new lights on the landscape. So when they're trying to keep that angle, they're around a light that's on the ground here, they tend to spiral into it, trying to keep that angle and run into the lights. And moths and this interruption of their navigation has kind of become a problem for them. So when they're spend all night flying around chaotically, trying around a stationary light, they can't find their food and they can't find a mate. And it must be very confusing for them. One really cool example of moth movement I wanted to mention is that some species can really migrate great distances. So there's this top moth here is called the bogong moth. It's a moth that's in Australia, and it's a really beloved moth. It's really cool that there's this kind of cultural identity of the bogong moth. Starts out in the lowland areas of, let's see, where is it from? Like kind of New South Wales, and then moves up into the mountains and spends their summers up at higher elevations. So there's this big migration that kind of resembles our army cutworm or miller moths. Who's familiar with the miller moth of New Mexico? Do you guys get those a lot here? Yeah. So some years you'll have like a really big boom of the miller moth where they're all in your car and in your house and dying in your house often. They usually like to hide in nice dark crevices at night. I know like one kind of silly thing is that the observatories around here have a really hard time with them because they can squeeze into any crack and end up in the mechanisms of the observatories. And they're like, how do we get rid of these moths? I'm like, I don't know. So these moths, like the bogong moth in Australia, they start at kind of more lowland, grassland areas in early seasons, and then move up to higher elevations to take advantage of wetter conditions and more nectar resources. So there's these are all in the family Noctuidae. And this is another big family that does a lot of pollination. And then finally, this is the silver Y moth. They're able to migrate from North Africa all the way up to sometimes Finland. So they can travel really huge distances, and they usually do that by catching air currents. They're not typically built for flying that far, but they've figured out how to do it by getting a ride on air currents. Okay, so moths are really dependent on their antenna for navigation and finding mates and food. So instead of a nose, they have those antennae to smell things. And males, as I mentioned, typically have those bigger, large antennae, and that's often more attractive to females too. The larger antenna you have, the better you're able to survive with giant, ridiculous antennae. So your genes must be pretty strong. Female moths emit hormones to help them find mates, and those with the bigger antenna are typically more able to easily to find them. So jumping into moth pollination. So Moths are visiting flowers to drink nectar to get carbohydrates to fuel their flight so they can go on to find mates. So, like I mentioned, bees earlier, they're collecting pollen, but moths are usually visiting flowers to drink that nectar and just incidentally getting pollen on their bodies. But this makes them really good at pollination because moths, unlike a lot of other insects, are very typically hairy and can carry pollen a lot better. So there's examples of moths moving pollen really long distances compared to bees as well. So bees, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide here. I'm jumping ahead. So they contribute a lot to crop pollination of things like peas, mustards, tree fruit, berries. They're a really important pollinator for a lot of different crop foods. Now, this is what I was mentioning. The moths are really important for gene flow since they can move a lot further than things like bees. So bees, when they're pollinating, they're stuck in an area around their nest. They're collecting pollen to take back to the nest to feed to their babies. But moths, they're free to go just about wherever they want. They're not tied to a single nest. So they can travel really long distances and move pollen really easily with their hairy bodies and fly really long distances. So moving that genetic diversity in plant populations. And here's just one example of a cabbage looper moth that can travel really long distances. There's one study that clocked the maximum flight distance in a single night for this moth at nearly 200 kilometers. So they can move pretty far in one night. And as I mentioned, I was going to talk about yucca moths. So there are some moths that have really unique, interesting relationships with the plants they pollinate. And this is a really interesting one of like almost an exact one-to-one, at least one genus to one genus pollination. So these moths, these little tiny white guys, who's seen them? Have you seen them in your yuccas before? Yeah. Oh, everyone's got to go look now. I'm so excited for you. It'll be here soon. So these moths exclusively pollinate everything in the yucca genus. So yucca plants don't create nectar at all. So other pollinators don't have a reason to visit the yucca plant because they don't produce a lot of pollen that bees would find useful, and they don't produce nectar. But what has happened for them to be able to pollinate is that they've created this evolutionary mutualism with the yucca moth, where the yucca moth only lives for a very short amount of time, this adult stage. And she is visiting yucca flowers to lay her eggs. So her eggs, the yucca moth larvae, depend entirely on yucca fruits for feeding the yucca moth caterpillars. So they depend on that to be pollinated. So somehow this has happened where they don't have a mouth. I mentioned some moths don't eat at all in their adult stages. These moths will use a little appendage on their face that's like a jaw, but no mouth, to pick up pollen like very intentionally from a yucca and fly to another yucca plant and place that pollen on the stigma. And this is super, super weird and rare in nature because it's usually much more like you're getting a resource immediately versus laying her eggs and then the next generation is what gets that resource. So it's a really interesting mutualism where she pollinates the flower, then lays her eggs on that flower because she knows that she pollinated it and it will produce fruit for her babies to eat. But even then, evolution always has something exciting to do. So there's cheater yucca moths that go lay their eggs on flowers that other yucca moths have pollinated. But yuccas typically somehow understand when there's too many eggs in a yucca fruit to actually produce seeds. So they'll abort flowers if the yucca moth gets overzealous. So it's a really, really weird study system that a lot of people work in. So it's a really cool, and I recommend you go out to your yucca this year and look for this tiny little white moth. And then there's a really cool example of pollination evolution history where there was this orchid discovered in Madagascar that has this absurdly long nectary that's like over a foot long. And Darwin, before the moth was found, predicted that there had to be a moth with a proboscis that could reach the bottom of this nectary. And sure enough, a few years later, they found the moth that had the absurdly long proboscis that could reach that end of the nectary. So pretty impressive that it's easy to see in some cases this plant and pollinator direct impact of coevolution. And finally, let's get into a little bit about why nocturnal pollinators have a little bit more challenges than our other pollinators. So as I mentioned, night pollution can really impact, or light pollution can really impact pollination of nighttime pollinated plants. So there's been studies where they compared cabbage thistle with and without street lamp lighting, and they found that 62% had fewer visitations of insects that were situated in darkness. So the artificially lit plants only saw 29% of the pollinators that the darkly lit cabbage thistle saw. So yeah, there's just, as more research comes out, we're clearly seeing that this is directly impacting this relationship between nocturnal pollinators and the plants that depend on them, which results in reduced fruit set. So what can we do to help our nocturnal pollinators? So we can always provide habitat, which I'm sure a lot of you are doing as Native Plant Society members and interested folks. So create pollinator habitat that has lots of different species and different families across different plant families. Avoid pesticide use. That might be pretty obvious. This can impact most insect pollinator species. Reduce artificial lighting. That's a big one. I know, does Silver City have a light ordinance? I'm not sure if you guys are dark sky certified or not, but.
It has an ordinance, but it's not enforced.
Okay. Oh, it's not enforced. Darn. Okay, well, maybe we can work on that. And then spread the word, let people know that there are pollinators active at night and you can go watch them. So, plant diversity for supporting insect diversity. So you probably already have dozens of different kinds of moths in your yard. If you just increase your native plant diversity and the amount you have, the better that will be for lots of different pollinators and other insects visiting your yard, and plant that variety. And I have a list here, but I'm not going to go into all the different species that you could plant. But another thing you could do that could really help pollinators, particularly in their winter stage, their overwintering stage, is do a little less tidying up in your garden. So that is typically better for insects if you leave the leaves, leave as much plant material on the ground over winter so they have cover, protection, they can hide in soil, in the topsoil and in leaf litter and survive the winter. That's usually something you can do to help lots of different insect species. And of course, reducing our night at light, this can disrupt the circadian rhythms of our insect pollinators, the flight, the navigation, mating, feeding, all of those things can be impacted. And we do have some firefly species kind of nearby in the area, especially in the Sky Islands in Arizona. But that's another species that can really benefit from reducing artificial light at night. So the kind of key rules of reducing light is turning off lights whenever possible. If lighting is necessary, use the lowest setting possible and use motion activated lights. This is one I need to practice more, is like making sure all my curtains are closed in my house so that your light isn't spilling out into the night. And then seek out dark sky initiatives if we can think more about enacting those ordinances a little better. And I want to highlight the Dark Sky International. They have some really great tools on how to enact this and convince other agencies and folks that have light on how to reduce that. So pesticides, as we mentioned before, neonicotinoids are a major threat, but there's also lots of other pesticides that are like neonicotinoids in that they are systemic. So this includes things like soil drenches or tree injections. Those are pesticides that move throughout a plant and are typically long-lived, and then they can be expressed in the soil, in the vegetation of the leaves, the caterpillars are eating of the moths, or even in the nectar of the flowers. So it's important to understand how these pesticides work and what impact they could have. And then also just understanding that if you're gardening for wildlife, the whole point is that they damage your plants a little bit, right? If you want to feed caterpillars of moths and butterflies, they're going to eat some of those plant leaves. So just keep in mind that might be a good thing, depending on your perspective. And recognize that there are beneficial insects in your space that are eating the pest insects. So if you use an insecticide to take care of a pest insect, that might also harm the beneficials, but also definitely take away the food of the beneficial insects. Oh, this is just a rant of like how terrible bug zappers are and how we need to throw them all away. They're really, really not good at what they're advertised they're doing. They are not good at killing any kind of biting insects, but they're very, very good at attracting moths and killing them, which aren't biting you and bothering you. So one little research project found out of the 10,000 insects killed by one bug zapper in one night, only 8 of them were mosquitoes. So they're really not helping you. They're really just killing moths. So yeah, be sure to give anyone a hard time that's using one. And of course, I'll just end on that there's so much left to learn with nocturnal pollinators. We have lots of research still to do. And I think that will become much easier to grasp as we can use more lab methods where we test pollen and eDNA that's left behind on flowers at night and have a better understanding of how they impact our ecosystems. And then just for some resources on moth identification, I love bugguide.net. That's always a fun one to use. Butterfliesandmoths.org also can give you lots of IDs. And then, of course, iNaturalist has lots of moth experts IDing things on there regularly. And then if you want to learn more, we have some firefly-friendly lighting practices that can be applied to moths as well. And we have a couple webinars and a podcast on our Xerces YouTube channel about fireflies and moths and nocturnal pollinators. So check those out. I want to say thank you so much to Xerces Society members. You guys are a whole third of our funding for the organization. So it's really amazing to continue this work because of the generosity of so many people. And of course, thank you to Petrie Foundation. They fund a lot of New Mexico work. And then I'll take questions.
Okay, before we get to that, this just in,
It's just-
so Kaitlin has agreed tomorrow morning at 9:30, we're going to meet at the Silver Creek Botanical Garden. She's not been there before. We're gonna just walk around. If you wanna come and talk with Kaitlin and ask some questions.
Come, we just removed all.
I know
all
that the
those
group
weeds.
was out today and they just made it beautiful. Everything's
Yeah.
in flower, right?
Yeah, it's okay. As long
Okay.
as it's what we typically say, it depends on where you are, but if you wait until like the risk of frost is basically over, that's when it's more safe to move your leaves. Yeah, yeah. So don't feel guilty.
I think you're okay.
Yeah, I think you're totally fine.
Okay. Anything on Zoom, question wise?
No, nothing in the
Okay,
chat.
who has a question?
I have a question.
Yes,
Yeah.
Susan.
I have heard, some years ago, the plants at Walmart are typically inundated with pesticides and growth hormones and all sorts of other things, awful things. Is it still true? Or-
Okay, so the question is, the Walmart, big box stores, they sell nursery plants that are full of really terrible pesticides. And is that still the case? So it's hard to say exactly what is in most nursery plants. I would say it's, yeah, pretty standard to have a pretty big mix of pesticides in any big box store nursery plants you buy, because they're buying from really big producers that depend on a lot of pesticide use to produce at that capacity. There's one really cool study that Xerces did with the Matthew Forster lab, God, 4 years ago now, where we sampled milkweed at different nurseries, including small organic nurseries, and big box stores. And we found that almost all of them were contaminated with at least some sort of pesticide. That could be an herbicide, an insecticide, or a fungicide. And usually they weren't at levels that were extremely toxic to most Lepidoptera caterpillars or moths. But it's really hard to say because the mixture, the amount, that's all really, we don't have the data to say. So, but if I can definitely share that study if that would be of interest to you. But yeah, it's very likely that there's, and what we recommend people do is just put a net over that plant for like the first year so that caterpillars aren't eating it, pollinators aren't visiting the flowers, because usually after a year, most of those pesticides will have broken down. So yeah, if you don't know, you can always ask people at nurseries. Probably you won't get any real answers at a big box store, but it's always a great idea to just ask even smaller nurseries if they have information about what it's been treated with. But yeah, it's a tough thing because yeah, but just letting producers and suppliers know that you're interested in pesticide-free plants is always a good thing. Letting them know there's demand for it.
One other question.
Yeah.
How many, species of, the bugs that light up at night, lightning bugs, do we have in New Mexico?
Okay, the question was how many lightning bugs, firefly species do we have in New Mexico? I think it's 19. And there's definitely more diversity kind of in the Sky Islands region. But you can see the Big Dipper firefly, which is the kind of one of the common eastern fireflies, and parts of like northeast New Mexico. So they're around. And then we also have glowworms. That includes glowworm species too.
Are glowworms a larva of a?
So good question. So they're all in the family Lampyridae. And there's flashing adult fireflies. That's what most people think of when they think of fireflies. And oftentimes the larvae of those do have some sort of glow to them. But glowworms are larvae, yes, that glow, but they're adult stage, they're adult fireflies, they're beetles, they're not flies. Their adult stage is not flashing. So that's just the distinction there is that, yeah, they're not as obvious as the adult fireflies. Yeah, they're very cool.
Ron, I know you have a question.
Well, I was just gonna comment.
Yeah.
Something I don't know if you've heard about in terms of distances.
Mhm.
There was a paper a couple of years, there's a very large hawk moth that lives in Europe
Okay.
called the Atlas moth.
Yes.
It's big enough that they were able to actually glue a radio transmitter on
No
its back. And this moth commutes, as it were, between mainland Europe and Africa by flying across the Mediterranean.
Oh my God. That's
I don't know
really
how
cool.
many moths they use for this experiment, but anyway.
Yeah.
They let some of these go, and then they had a small plane which could receive the radio transmission.
Yeah.
They followed these moths across the Mediterranean.
Wow.
And one of the things they discovered is that so a storm conveniently came up during the time when moths were crossing the Mediterranean.
Mhm.
And they were tracking these moths, and the moths did not deviate course, even though there were strong winds. So what that told them was that the moths knew exactly where they were going.
Yeah.
They had a tracking mechanism to get from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, and they think that that's the indication that the moths are using the magnetic field of the Earth
Mhm.
as a way of navigating. Some birds do that.
Yeah.
So it's not impressive.
Yeah.
But new information on moth navigation. They also use starlight, I believe, as well.
Mhm.
In addition to.
Yeah.
Is that Starlight or Starlink? Just.
No.
Bad jokes.
John.
How often do they commute?
Well, these particular moths,
No,
it's.
I never
It sounded to me like they didn't go a lot into the biology of this. The scientists on this paper are largely acoustic engineers.
Mhm.
Figured out how to do this, right? And a lot of the analysis was about the tracking and so on. But it sounded like they migrate probably on a seasonal basis. Maybe they, for half a year, they spend that in Africa and the other half of the year in Europe. That would make sense because of the climate changes, maybe one climate is better at one time of the year than another, so we go back to.
There's a question on the chat that maybe Ron can help me with, is that do moths migrate in stages like the monarch butterfly? Do you know if there's like a generation that moves one way and then a generation that moves the other way, or is it the same generation?
Stages.
Yeah.
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 The monarch does it in stages in one direction, but not in the other.
Yeah, not in the other direction. Yeah.
Which is kind of weird.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of that. No.
Yeah. We're not sure.
The other comment or question?
I was just wondering,
Okay.
so they all moths die, I mean, the females die after they've laid their eggs.
Yes. So, well, not. Meh. So the question was, all female moths die after they've laid their eggs. I mean, technically, there are some that are potentially able to have a couple broods. Do you know, Ron?
Well, no, I think but when the males and females die after one cycle, but
Okay.
there are moths that only have one cycle in a year.
In a year, yeah.
But there are moths that have as many as 3 cycles,
Mhm.
spring, summer, and fall, 3 generations. in
Yeah.
1 year.
So then
Multi-volting.
The
Yeah.
fall eggs would then last a lot longer.
Yes.
And
So
kind of like the-
But the moths where the females have mouth parts live a lot longer than.
Yes.
Where they don't have.
That's a good point. Is that, yeah, the females that have mouth parts, they'll live a lot longer.
And amazingly enough, some moths can overwinter. I mean, like here, there are moths that overwinter, even though the climate is quite severe.
Mhm.
And then they reappear in the spring,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I know in butterflies and probably in moths is a different species overwinter at each stage. So there's some species that overwinter as eggs, some that overwinter as larvae, some as pupa in their cocoons, and then some as adults. So like the butterflies you see flying in the middle of winter, almost like the morning cloak, they overwinter as adults. So I'm sure there's lots of examples of butterflies that
So
do
I have a
that.
question for you.
Yeah.
How much is known about pollination by microbes?
How much is known about pollination by micromoths? I haven't noticed any studies that a micromouth.
Some data, but it
Yeah.
seems to be very limited.
Yeah, it seems to be that a lot of research is just very dependent on just nocturnal pollination, just exclusion studies where it's like, well, we know nocturnal pollinators were visiting, but we don't know what they were. But yeah, I've definitely seen lots of micromoths on flowers, so
Right.
that's
So Caitlin, it's
Yeah.
8:07.
Oh, yeah.
And one last question from moi.
Yeah.
You alluded to it earlier about the Senate Bill 5
yes.
and that the governor signed it, and we know that there's some challenges, or, there's some issues, but why would that bill, Senate Bill 5 be so good for not people that shoot things, which, I used to, that's fine, or catch things on a hook, but why is that important for invertebrates?
Yes, why is Senate Bill 5 important? So Senate Bill 5 is a wildlife reform package that reformed the authority that the State Department of Game and Fish has to now have the discretion to work on whatever species they want. So they do work on some invertebrates like snails, like spring snails, some amphipods. But they haven't worked on any insects at all, and they don't have clear authority to. This bill gives them clear authority to work on whatever species they want, and they are increasing license fees, which haven't been increased in like 20 years. So it's just doing a lot of important updates to our Department of Game and Fish, which is now the Department of Wildlife. And is just opening up a lot more avenues for funding and research into lots of different more holistic wildlife studies that just kind of updating it that a lot of states have already done, so it's nice that New Mexico is one of them now.
So it doesn't say that New Mexico Wildlife Department will,
Yeah,
it says
it
they
shall.
can,
They may.
they may.
They may.
But we're way behind in New Mexico in terms of other states and coming to that realization that their wildlife means things other than fish
Yeah.
and things, and and things you
But now
want.
we're ahead of Arizona and Texas and
Not clear though, what the governor did, is going to hold.
yeah,
She said
I'm
that if her pocket veto was, didn't go through, she was gonna veto the whole bill, as she did last year.
Yeah, so we're in a stay tuned.
Yeah, we're kind of in a stay tuned, but I don't know, just the lawyers I was in a meeting with earlier, and like she did it to another bill too, and this session, and it's looking like that could easily be unlawful. So it might, even if that's her threat, she's gonna repeal the bill. She may not have a leg to stand on, so.
So we're gonna leave it at
Yeah.
that.
Politics,
Let that work
yay.
itself out in the courts.